This year I experimented with planting onions in succession. Have you ever heard of onion succession planting? I know I haven't, but I've really embraced succession planting in general so I can get more fresh harvest throughout the year. Now this was a pretty detailed experiment which I shared about in this video, so you can go check out all the details for that, but today I'm going to show you the results. The first planting that was a huge experiment was planting short day onions in the fall. Now I did that in lots of different ways, but this is some of the results from it here. This is some of the last ones that I have to harvest here in my green stalk, and I'll come back and we'll harvest that one. But first, the main part of that harvest was in May, which was the earliest that I've ever harvested onions before. I was really excited about that. So now I'm going to show you that video that I recorded in May to show you most of my short day onion harvest. Now I do want to clarify, just in case I don't mention that in that video, I can't remember, it's been a couple months since I recorded it, but I started harvesting those short day onions in April in grow bags, which was the earliest ever. But here's a look at those short day onions that I had planted in the fall and how they did when I harvested them in May. The onion tops are starting to flop over, so I know that these are ready. These are the short day onions I planted at the same time that I planted the broccoli and the cabbage, and I'm actually very amazed that they got to be as large as this, maybe the size of a baseball, because they did not have a ton of sunlight. They were dwarfed by all these other plants, but I'm super impressed with this. I'll be able to start curing them and using them. My intermediate day onions that I planted this year are nowhere near ready, so this will be really good because I've not ever been able to get a harvest in May. I mean, that's very, very early. These I'll take to start curing. The other two I'll make sure to use in the kitchen. But I have one more set of short day onions to show you about. A couple of those are ready, a couple have bolted. It's interesting to see the difference because the first ones to harvest were the ones in grow bags. So those are the ones that actually did really well. I think I only had one of them bolt. They had been in grow bags for the entire winter, and I brought them out when the weather warmed up. These I planted in March. And then the other ones I'm going to show you now, I planted in the fall, and I covered them up during our cold snap. And I also had lettuce planted way too close to them. The lettuce kind of overtook it, so I think that's probably one reason they're not as strong of a harvest, but I'll take you over there and you can be able to see that. But first, let's go put these to start curing. I normally cure onions in the garage, especially because most of the time I'm harvesting all my onions at once in June, and I need them to last for a really long time. But with just this amount of onions, it's likely I'll have to start coming to use them before they're even done curing. So in this case, I'm going to put them here in the greenhouse. This is going to be a more shady location, and I'll be able to have some ventilation. It's not super hot yet. We're still in May, so it shouldn't get too bad, but at least I can come out here easily and be able to harvest without cluttering the garage. And plus, honestly, putting onions in the garage, even with a fan going, it makes your whole garage smell like onions, which my husband's not too keen on. He tolerates it because I'm like, we don't have to buy onions, but if I can avoid that for as long as possible, I'm going to go ahead and cure them in here. So this is how I do it. The only time onions are candidates for curing is when they haven't bolted. Any bolted onions or any that get damaged with the neck in some way, I'm going to use them up. But for those that naturally start flopping down, or I can harvest them before they started bolting, I can cure them. I'm not going to wash them because the goal with curing is to get them dry. So any kind of extra water could potentially lead to rot. Honestly, ideally, I would have harvested these before we got so much rain last night, just because they are so wet right now. But I'm also hoping that putting these in the dry greenhouse will help with that so that they can dry out more quickly. And if they get a little bit of sunlight on them, it's okay. It's not a huge deal, but I do like to keep them in the shade so they don't cook. Give them plenty of room between each other for airflow. And I think these are yellow gray necks, if I'm not mistaken. This is the first time I've ever grown these. I don't typically grow short day just because I found intermediate day have done better in my climate when I plant in the spring, but this was obviously a way to prove me wrong because these were the best planted in spring. So let's go ahead and take a look at the other bed and see if there's any that I need to add here. So this is the planting of onions that I planted last fall. I covered them when we got down to 0. But again, I had lettuce that I planted, which I thought was far enough away from the onions, but they just overwhelmed the onions. So I think that probably played a role in them not doing as great. This one and this one are probably the only ones that are about ready. This one I think is about to bolt, but this one for sure is ready. And then this one right here is starting to bolt. I will probably wait and pick this tonight. We're doing a stir fry, so I'll definitely want to use that. This one's bolting, this one's bolting. So it looks like they're either bolting, or we have one that's ready. But what's interesting is that this one that was ready was not as close to the lettuce. So I really feel like having the lettuce near them stressed them in some way. That's gotta be it. This one may be starting to bolt just because I can see kind of a central stalk here, and the bulb is not super large yet. So I may end up harvesting this too, but I'm gonna go ahead and cure this one. But for the other ones, I think I'm just gonna pick them as needed for now. And then when I run out of these, then I'll go to the ones in the greenhouse. The only short day onions I have left to harvest are the ones that I planted in my green stock. These are the ones that I kept in my greenhouse all winter long. I brought them into the garage when we got down to 0 degrees. That was just 1 or 2 nights, but they are actually looking the best. So I'm gonna wait. They haven't started flopping over like the ones in the grow bags did, or the ones in the raised bed, which is kind of interesting because they were definitely planted sooner than the ones in the raised bed. But all this has been kind of a really fun experiment. After the short day, I'll be looking forward to intermediate day harvest. Those are the ones that I planted. I'll have to look at my calendar, but it would have been March, I would assume, the first planting, and then the second planting I planted in April. So stay tuned. I will come back with another follow-up with the intermediate day and the long day onions that I've planted in my garden, and we'll see how this experiment with succession planting onions in my Arkansas garden goes. In this bed, I just harvested the intermediate day onions that I planted from seed. I planted them from seed indoors on December 4th, and then I planted them out, I'm thinking it was the late part of February, maybe the early part of March, and then I harvested them in June. One thing I noticed about this harvest was that these ended up being smaller in size compared to the ones that I buy as transplants from Dixondale Farms. That's usually where I buy my onion transplants, but you can get them at local garden centers as well. But they were smaller, they were more the size of a baseball, but I'm really hopeful that they will store longer. That's really my goal. But it'll be interesting to compare how long they store to know if it's worth it to sacrifice the size of the onion for the longevity of storage. But so far, that's been fun to experiment with. Now, that was my first succession planting of the intermediate day onions, and let me show you the second succession planting because it didn't go quite as I expected. This is the second succession planting of intermediate day onions. My goal for this was to get them harvesting later so that I could store them even longer, but you can see these in particular did not grow as big. We're talking about a little more than a golf ball. This one's a little bit bigger, but we got some smaller ones here. You can see they're all ready because they're all flopping over. I think this could be for 2 reasons. One, this nasturtium plant over here actually kind of overtook this bed. So I think in combination with the tree right beside it and the nasturtium, they really didn't get a whole lot of light. They got plenty of water because the Garden in Minutes garden grids covered them with water. I can feel how damp the soil is. So water wasn't the problem at all. And I amended the soil like I do anything else. So I really think it was the shade. I think that if I would have had these in more sun, they would have gotten bigger before being ready to harvest. But again, it'll be interesting to see how well they store because I planted them from seed as opposed to transplant. Another thing to note is that with all the intermediate day onions that I planted from seed, they did not bolt. I may have had 1 or 2 total bolt, which is a record for me. Usually with transplants, I have a lot of bolting. So that was really encouraging as well. Let me clarify one thing. I mentioned intermediate day because most of these were intermediate day, but I think I did have 1 or 2 long days. The Patterson onion I planted in the other bed, and it was the same, like the results were the same with the Patterson as the other intermediate day. So I do want to clarify there were some long days in there, but I really didn't see a difference in between those. One final thing with the short day onions, most of the ones that did great, I had actually had sheltered in some way. You saw that either in the greenhouse or they were covered. I also planted some short day onions back in the back of my garden. They survived, but their bulbs were probably about as big as this total. So I know that the cold definitely impacted those because I didn't cover them. So I'm not sure that planting short day onions in my climate, zone 8A, was actually the best thing to do unless I can cover them. So that's one thing I learned about that. Now let's go back to the final harvest of the short day. I think you'll be really impressed with this. I know I was. You saw most of the short day onions that I harvested back in May, but some of the ones, especially in the green stalk, They continued to grow and didn't start flopping over until recently, and we're in July. But I want to show you this one. This may be the largest onion I've ever grown, period. And to grow it in this leaf planter of the green stalk has been pretty incredible. And it's gonna be really hard to get out. I can already feel it so entrenched in here. Check that out. I can't wait to weigh that. This is heavy. Okay, this thing came from one pocket of the green stalk. That's incredible. I think part of it is because this green stalk gets watered really well. So this onion got plenty of water. But to me, this whole process has been such a teaching opportunity for me. I started harvesting those short day onions in April. I'm finishing the harvest in July, so that's something I'll continue to experiment with. And as you saw with the intermediate day, I definitely learned something from that, especially with planting them from seed. But I'm really encouraged that with the right planning, I can harvest onions earlier and into later, and hopefully the ones that I planted from seed will store longer so I can have onions even longer throughout the season and not have to rely so much on all of the chopping and freezing and dehydrating in order to preserve them. Because the more that I can have them in this state, the easier they are to deal with in the kitchen and the less work it is for me in preservation. I hope this experiment has been as fun for you to watch as it has been for me to do, but don't forget to check out this video on the whys behind everything I did. You may or may not be able to plant onions in the fall, so that's really important to know if you're trying to replicate some of what I did. You may or may not be able to, but my whole point is to encourage you to think outside the box and experiment, and you may find something that you never knew was possible. I know I did with these onions. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next video.